Hey everybody, Trey here. Welcome back to another video. It's been a little while since we've released a video here on the channel, and that's because we've been in a bit of a lull as far as severe weather events go, at least as far as robust severe weather events go. We have had pretty much daily severe weather opportunities across the country, but they have certainly been on the lower end of the intensity scale, maybe with the exception of yesterday, May 13th, across parts of the Gulf Coast where we had that enhanced risk for that potent squall line that had some strong winds and a few tornado reports. But other than that, it's been some lower end days across the country, and that is expected to persist into at least the end of this week into the weekend. As you can see here on the SBC Convective Outlooks page, multiple days of just low-end marginal and slight risks here for at least the next 3 to 4 days and perhaps beyond into the weekend. But we are seeing some signs that we may begin to see a pattern change come early next week for at least a several-day stretch. And so because we haven't done a video in a while, I wanted to do a video today just going over the threats the next few days, not looking at any specific setup in particular, but just going over some of our short-range model guidance to look at the threats for the next few days, and then we'll look at some longer-range guidance to see how this pattern change is expected to go. So that's what we're going to do in this video. We're going to start off first with just a brief look at the tornado counts and distribution across the country so far in 2024. Our tornado season forecast from back in February has gone pretty well. Pretty happy with how that's gone so far. So we'll go in, take a look at our tornado counts and tornado distribution across the U.S. Up to this point in mid-May. Then we'll take a look at some short-range model guidance for the next few days, just going over the overall look of the pattern for the next few days and why we've been in a little bit of a lull and why it's expected to continue through the rest of this week. And then we'll look ahead at some of our longer-range guidance to discuss that pattern change that is on the table. And all of you storm chasers out there should be pretty happy with what we have in store and what the long-range guidance is showing. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. So here's a graph of our current tornado reports so far in 2024 across the U.S. The thick red line you see here is our tornado count through this point in the year so far, and the thick black line here is our typical average as far as tornado count goes through the year. And so you can see right now we are sitting well above average here. This was valid through yesterday, May 13th, and we are sitting quite a bit above average here as we go into the middle portion of May. For a while there, we were sitting right at or just below average here through March and April. And then as we went into the back half of April and early May, we saw a substantial uptick in the tornado counts here, bringing us to this point where we are sitting quite a bit above average. And that is something we talked about in our tornado season forecast. We were expecting kind of a normal March and April, and then toward the back half of April, we were expecting quite a significant uptick in tornado activity lasting through May, and that is certainly what has happened thus far this spring. And you can see we are well above average here, 781 tornado reports so far through May 13th. Up to this point, we usually sit at about 573, so we are about 200 or so tornado reports above average. Quite a decent chunk above average here as we go into the middle portion of May. And that is something we talked about in our tornado forecast going back a few months. Here's how the tornado distribution has looked so far. This was April, and you can see here 384 tornado reports for all of April across the U.S. That is well above average, probably 150 to 200% above average as far as our April tornado counts go, comparing it to the climatological average. Lots of activity here from our traditional areas, Nebraska down into Kansas and Oklahoma, some activity down there in Texas, as well as a maximum there in the Ohio River Valley there. So parts of the Midwest down to the south into parts of Kentucky. Those have been kind of our two hot spots so far this year, especially during that uptick in severe weather from the back half of April into May. And that is also something we talked about in our tornado season forecast. We saw we were forecasting at least a return to perhaps our more traditional tornado alley areas, that central to southern plains area, and also out in the Midwest. And we have certainly seen the Midwest shine, particularly in Ohio. This is our current May tornado count. We're sitting at 234 tornado reports through this point in May. So we're starting to climb up there to our climatological average for tornado reports in May, and we're only halfway through the month. And as I said before, we're starting to see some signs that the back half of May could be fairly active. Again, we'll get to that in just a second. But overall, we've seen the hot spots kind of be that central to southern plains area, Nebraska, Iowa, down into Kansas and Oklahoma, and then another maximum there out in the Midwest, particularly surrounding Ohio. Ohio has been a hot spot this year. Lots of activity in the Ohio region and the Ohio River Valley region. And that, again, was forecast pretty well by our back in our video in February that forecast for the entire spring. So pretty happy with how the tornado season forecast has gone so far. And again, we are well above average at this point. We'll see how that continues going into the back half of May. I suspect, given some of the trends we're seeing on the long-range guidance, that we will continue to stay above average through the end of May into June. All right, let's dive into the next few days here as far as severe potential goes. Again, just a few days of marginal to slight risks here for at least the next 3 to 4 days, and then beyond that, model discrepancy increases. But let's outline the risks for you here over the next few days. Today we have mostly a few different areas of severe risk, but the greatest potential exists across the southeast. A couple different areas of slight risk, level 2 out of 5 potential there. One with an ongoing QLCS across parts of the Florida Peninsula, with a tornado and damaging wind threat there. And then farther to the north across Tennessee into northern Alabama, Georgia, South Carolina, we have another slight risk there for mostly a wind and hail threat. Couple marginal risk, level 1 out of 5 elsewhere across northern New Hampshire and Vermont. Broad marginal risk from the Rockies eastward into the central high plains. Wyoming, Colorado, Nebraska, South Dakota, western Kansas there under the gun for that level 1 out of 5 risk. And then a conditional risk of a supercellular 2 down there in West Texas. Again, tornado risk there is going to be greatest in Florida. A couple low-end tornado risk areas outside of that as well, but mostly a large hail and wind damage risk with the threats today. Going into tomorrow, a few marginal risk areas as well, including one here, a big one, from the southern plains into the Midwest, eastern New Mexico, Texas Panhandle, northeastward into Iowa. Low and severe risk here. We could see perhaps an upgrade here within the next day or so to this area, but for now just a low-end marginal risk, and then a couple marginal risk areas across the eastern seaboard. And then going into Thursday. Thursday looks to be one of the more potent days of the next few. We have a slight risk down into parts of northern and central Texas with a 15% hatched significant severe contour there. Basically the area west of Wichita Falls, southward to San Antonio, under the gun for perhaps significant severe weather, including the threat for large to very large hail and damaging wind. Maybe a tornado or two with that activity, but we are going to see most of the activity confined to that southern portion of the U.S. for Thursday. And Friday, we have a day 4 risk there outlined from Louisiana into Mississippi by the SPC, and then beyond that, model discrepancy increases going into the weekend. So that's what's going on for the risk areas here. Let's take a look at what's going on right now. This is the current SPC mesoanalysis page at 500 millibars, and we have had a little bit of a trough, a little bit of a lower amplitude feature here traversing across the southern half of the U.S. That has been our main synoptic driver for severe weather the last couple of days. Again, yesterday, May 13th, we had that enhanced risk across the Gulf Coast. That was initiated by this lower amplitude, but still intense trough here moving across the southern U.S. Stronger belt of flow there, relegated to the Gulf Coast, and that is what's keeping our threat going here across the southeast for today's setup. So that is going to continue, but notice here the flow across the country is not all that strong here. We don't have any of these strong, real potent troughs making their way into the country. We have what's called a split flow regime, where we have our polar jet up here, stronger belt of flow up in here, still on the weaker side, but that is kind of our stronger belt of flow relegated to the northern plains into southern Canada. And then we have our subtropical jet down here across the southern portion of the country. That is why our main severe risks have been relegated here to the southern portion of the country recently. We haven't had any notable sweeping of the moisture out into the Gulf, any notable cold frontal intrusions to really sweep the moisture out. So we've had the moisture sticking around here across the southern U.S., and that has allowed for at least low-end potential for severe weather for several days across the southern U.S., but we haven't seen a whole lot come out of that, just some large hail, damaging winds, and a tornado or two for the past several days, and that is going to continue going into the late week portion this week into the weekend. And that is because of this split flow regime. And this was something we struggled with earlier on in the season. We had this kind of split flow, stronger belt of flow up here to the north, and a stronger subtropical jet down here to the south. You really want those to phase together to get your big, higher amplitude troughing, your negatively tilted, robust troughs to come through. That's when those two jets kind of phase together, and we don't have these two separate streams of stronger flow. That can really put a wrench in severe potential, at least widespread severe potential, and that usually does confine things down here to the southern U.S., and that's what's been the case for the past several days, and going into the next several days before next week rolls around. All right, let's take a look at some model data now. This is our 6Z NAM, our latest full NAM run that's in. The 12Z is coming in now, but for our purposes in this video, the 6Z run is out fully, so it'll be optimal for our usage here. So we're just going to look ahead at the next few days, see how the pattern evolves. This is at 500 millibars. Here's that trough across the southern U.S. going to continue to make its way off to the east. And then behind this trough, we see that split flow regime really rear its head. As we go into Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, you see those two separate jet streams making their way across the U.S. Here across the northern U.S., we have a very strong jet stream making its way in. That is going to not be of much influence for severe weather potential across the U.S. because of this southern stream. Here's our southern stream there, so our subtropical jet. A little bit of a trough situated within that flow, but some slightly stronger flow there across Mexico into Texas, the Gulf Coast states. That will allow our severe weather potential to continue across the southern U.S. where the moisture is for the next several days. Somewhat of a positively tilted, weak, low amplitude trough here, so not going to be a robust severe weather event by any means, but still, we will have enough forcing here going into perhaps particularly Thursday and Friday to maintain that severe threat across parts of Texas and then into the Gulf Coast states. So this split flow regime, again, is not something we like to see for severe weather chances. If you're a storm chaser, you want to see those jets consolidate into larger waves, more robust waves here, rather than having these two separate areas of flow. But that is what looks like it's going to be for the next several days, and what's been kind of plaguing us here recently as far as our severe weather potential goes. Our lower severe weather potential across the U.S. has gone. But our moisture has remained, so our moisture has not been an issue here with these setups. We haven't had any really strong frontal intrusions to sweep that moisture down into the Gulf. You can see here at the start of this model run, 60s dew points well up into the Midwest there, 70s dew points just offshore. Those are going to not really make a robust advance into the Gulf. We're going to see a quick return of those dew points for Wednesday, Thursday, into Friday, especially across the southern portion of the U.S., 60s dew points all the way up here on the NAM model to the Great Lakes region. So we do have that threat, that moisture return all the way up into the Great Lakes, at least with low 60s dew points. Our most robust moisture, of course, relegated here down to the south, but 70s dew points flowing up into Texas and Oklahoma for our threat on Thursday, and then we continue that into Friday as that threat shifts east. Nice wide broad area of 70s dew points onshore from southern Texas eastward to basically the Mississippi and Alabama, southern Mississippi, Alabama, western Florida panhandle area. So a broad region of severe threat, of broad, rich moisture there for our Friday threat, it looks like. But that's why we've been able to maintain at least some severe threat, particularly across the southern portions of the country. That subtropical jet has been fairly active, split off from that northern stream jet with that remnant moisture that has maintained itself through the last several days. So we've had a lot of these lower end risks from southwest Kansas southward into Oklahoma and Texas the last few days. That is because our moisture has stuck around and our subtropical jet has been fairly active and bringing us at least a little bit of some short waves through there and some stronger flow aloft to help maintain the synoptic forcing for lower end severe threats across this area. So that is what has been, that's what's expected for the next few days here. Again, on Thursday looks to be our most robust day here. I'll just take a quick look at what that is expected to be. We see, again, just some slightly stronger flow making its way into Texas there with that subtropical jet. So a couple of little kinks there in the flow for Thursday, but our moisture sticks around. We have a nice return of 60s and 70s dew points all the way up into southern Oklahoma. Nice little dry line bulge there as modeled by the NAM. So we could see that area just ahead of that dry line bulge down south along the dry line be our main area for severe weather on Thursday. Just take a quick sounding here on the NAM ahead of that dry line bulge just to give you an idea of the possible threats there. Because we don't have a very robust mid and upper level response, we shouldn't have a super strong low level response. We probably will see at least some development of a weak surface flow out here across West Texas, eastern New Mexico, but not really a super strong low-level response, given we don't have one of those real deep digging, high-amplitude troughs making its way into the southern U.S. So here we are for Thursday. Robust instability, that has been the theme here over the past several days. Robust instability with that remnant rich low-level moisture, and that is going to be the case here going into the late week period. Upwards of 4,000 joules per kilogram of mixed layer CAPE. Low-level shear, again, because we don't have that strong low-level response, is expected to remain on the weaker side, but we do have plenty of deep layer shear for supercells, and at least veering winds with height should foster that supercell mode ahead of the dry line on Thursday. Across parts of northern and central Texas there, but low-level shear on the weak side with robust instability. That is a classic combo for large hail. So large hail going to be the main threat here. Tornado threat should remain fairly low for the next several days going into the weekend because of this kind of split flow regime, weaker low-level responses. But Thursday certainly does look to be fairly robust. But we will have kind of that low-end threat maintain itself through the end of the week into the weekend. All right, now let's take a look at some longer range data going into next week. So we're going to look at the 6Z GFS ensemble and the 0Z European model ensemble. So again, these are ensemble models. So instead of looking at one particular model, operational GFS, for example, that is only one member of the ensemble. So the ensemble has multiple different members whose initial conditions have been tweaked ever so slightly so that we can get a better picture of a bunch of different outcomes and kind of average them together to get a better, more accurate picture of how the pattern might progress rather than looking at just one single member. So here we are at the 6Z GEFS, so the GFS ensemble, and this is the 500 millibar. This is the mean 500 millibar height and wind. So the average among all of the ensemble members of the 500 millibar pattern. This is what it's expected to look like going into this week and then going into next week eventually. So you can really see as we go through here, as we thumb through the pattern, you'll see that we have that split flow regime really rear its head. So the ensemble model members are locked into this idea of this split flow regime, maintaining this somewhat low amplitude pattern across the southern U.S., this subtropical jet, and our northern jet stream kind of separate here. But watch what happens as we go into the weekend and early next week. We kind of lose this split flow regime, and by Monday into Tuesday, we start to see this kind of consolidation of the overall pattern at 500 millibars. And we see this a very favorable look for severe weather across the central U.S. Trough over the western half of the country. So you can see the trough there, the downward kinks in the height contours there. So the ensemble members are pretty much locked into the idea that we're going to see a transition to more troughing across the west coast and broad southwesterly flow across the central U.S. out ahead of these troughs. So that is a very favorable look for a return to severe weather here across the central U.S. Troughing across the west, ridging across the eastern half of the country, and in between those we're going to have broad southwesterly flow, which is favorable for supporting severe weather, especially if we can get some more robust shortwaves to rotate through this flow. And that troughing is expected to persist for quite a while here. I'll continue through the pattern. You can see that trough across the west coast maintains itself for several days here going into next week. This is Friday next week. We maintain that southwesterly flow with west coast troughing there, ridging across the eastern half of the country. So that is a very favorable look going into it. Beyond perhaps next weekend and beyond, we maintain that southwesterly flow across the country before we get a little bit of ridging, it looks like, to build in across the central U.S. So we could have a prolonged period of west coast troughing and broad southwesterly flow out ahead of that. And again, this is just an average, so we're not going to be able to pick out any individual shortwaves here or anything, but the pattern recognition here shows that we're going to have broad, large-scale troughing across the western half of the country, likely going to have some smaller little shortwaves rotating through the flow into the central U.S., and with broad southwesterly flow aloft, that should be plenty of synoptic support needed to support a long-term severe weather uptick, long-term uptick in severe weather potential across the central U.S. Again, we can't pinpoint locations at this point, a week plus out, but it does look like that we're going to be situated well here in the central U.S. ahead of this broad west coast troughing to support, at least synoptically, severe weather for several days here going into next week and next weekend. Here's the European ensemble, showing pretty much the same thing here. So here's that split flow coming in to round out this week into the weekend. There's your two different jet streams there. So we maintain that low and severe threat across the southern U.S. going into late this week and weekend. But then again, just like the GFS was showing, we get a consolidation of the jet stream, and we maintain that west coast troughing, broad southwesterly flow out ahead of it. This is Wednesday next week. The European model also showing broad, large-scale troughing here across the west coast, strong westerly to southwesterly flow across the central U.S. Very favorable look for severe weather, and locked in with what the GFS ensemble was showing. So we have some pretty good model agreement that we're going to see a prolonged period of broad southwesterly flow with troughing across the western U.S. Into the central U.S., which is favorable for a prolonged period of severe weather going into at least next weekend, it looks like. So we could have a nice, real prolonged uptick in severe weather here across the central U.S. Let's take a look at moisture. So we're going to look at the mean dew point among the ensemble members. So just like the 500 millibar map, mean 500 millibar map we were looking at, we're going to look at the mean dew point. So just the average dew point among the ensemble members. So here we are, GEFS. So again, the blues and purples are your 60s and 70s dew points where our rich, robust moisture is. So this week, we kind of maintain that across the southern U.S. here, which is why we're going to have that robust threat across the Gulf Coast states here. This is valid on Friday, so that's going to maintain that threat there. Then we go into next week. That moisture not going to go anywhere. And so as we have this troughing building back in across the west coast and broad southwesterly flow out ahead of it into the central U.S., we're going to have ample moisture for that troughing to work with here. You can see here on Tuesday, a broad area of warm sector from the central plains into the Midwest and deep south. So a broad area of rich, robust, low-level moisture here ahead of that trough, a combination that you like to see if you're a storm chaser. We have a strong troughing aloft with multiple days of moisture return here across the central and southern U.S. Should be a favorable combination to maintain severe weather through at least next weekend. Here we are on the European model. Same thing here. Those dew points not going to go very far here after our Thursday, Friday threats here. And you see going into next week, multiple days of strong moisture return, that dry line setting up here somewhere across the central and southern plains with a broad warm sector out ahead of it, those 60s and 70s dew points, very widespread across the U.S. among the ensemble members. So here you go into next week, multiple days of robust moisture return across the central and southern U.S. ahead of that troughing. That is certainly a look that supports robust severe weather chances going into next week. So that's kind of what's going on right now. Don't want to get too deep into the details here yet, but the idea is pretty simple. We're going to have several days of low and severe potential, particularly across the central and southern U.S. associated with that southern stream, that southern subtropical jet stream. The days we're looking at right now is perhaps most robust are going to be Thursday and Friday, that significant severe risk outline for Texas on Thursday. Then going into Friday, we have that risk outline for Louisiana and Mississippi, as we have robust moisture and some lower amplitude features moving in that subtropical jet stream there across the Gulf Coast region. Then we go into next week, and the ensemble models are pretty locked in to a very prolonged period, starting early in the week, Monday to Tuesday, and lasting through perhaps at least the weekend next week for a prolonged period of troughing across the western U.S., moving into the central plains with broad southwesterly flow across the central U.S., acting upon a broad, rich area of low-level moisture. Those dew points here in the 60s and 70s up to the central plains and Midwest, and with a fairly broad east-west extent. So those are two factors you need for severe weather, and the ensemble model is certainly locked in to the idea that we're going to have troughing on the synoptic scale with a broad area of rich moisture here across the central U.S. That usually means a pretty big uptick in severe weather, and so that is what is on tap for next week. So we'll be back as needed with updates on specific setups. Right now, didn't want to go too deep into the details with any particular day, but overall, looking at a pretty low-end risk going into the weekend. Perhaps some more robust areas here across the Gulf Coast states, and then we get into a storm chaser's paradise here. It looks like going into next week with a prolonged period of troughing acting upon rich moisture here across the central U.S. So that's going to do it. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.